this opportunity for us to come together and have these conversations are becoming far and few in between. And what I mean by that, it seems like more and more our spaces are being taken up by the Katy Perrys, if you will, of the world. And there's nothing wrong with that. But Victor said something earlier that part of what we also need to be engaging with are conversations that contribute to our awakening, our knowledge, and our empowerment. So when Victor approached me about sharing something, I really was not sure what I would bring. But the vision spoke to something that I'm really passionate about, and that is how do we first forge community, particularly queer community, and then have conversations that sometimes we don't have or they get framed for us in ways that we just enter into. And I think about this current moment that we're in, especially regarding same-sex marriage, as a sort of framing that's been happening, especially in the last 20 years, that sometimes I think we enter into without maybe full acknowledgement of some of the complexities around that and some of the issues that go unacknowledged. So part of my talk is to talk first and foremost about how I think it's important that we have this moment around same-sex marriage. And many people who spoke before me and our MCs for this evening who have entered into that institution, I want to say congratulations. But I also want to hold space to say that my talk also wants to acknowledge the fact that for many of us, either by choice or by circumstance, singlehood would be our reality for life. And I don't think that has to be looked upon as some failure. But I think it has the potential to be seen that way, especially if we assume that the idea of marriage is what we should be aspiring to. And I think what I want to get us to think about is the fact that for most of us, our reality will be singlehood. But singlehood doesn't mean being alone, right? Love the ones you're with. Because sometimes for many of us, that's who you will have to carry you through your journey. So when I think back to June 26, 2013, and I want you to go there with me. If you want, you can continue to breathe through your ass. So as you're breathing, I also want you to reflect mentally on where you were June 26, 2013. What you were doing, who you were with. It's not that long ago. We're almost approaching a year, right? And if you have any recollection, especially if you were in the United States, you recall that it was on that day, it was a Wednesday, that news came down from the Supreme Court of the United States that two decisions were being passed that would really, in many ways, move us forward. And by us, I'm meaning this movement, the LGBT movement, and for some people, our nation forward. One of the decisions was the overturning of DOMA, right, which was the Defense of Marriage Act, a policy that was passed during the Clinton administration that, in effect, outlawed same-sex marriage from being recognized by our federal government. So the overturning of that, in many ways, made the statement that as a federal government, we would acknowledge same-sex marriage. And again, that was a very triumphant moment. But SCOTUS wasn't finished. SCOTUS also had another decision that was also part of this movement right around same-sex marriage, and it had to do with what happened in California back in 2008 regarding Proposition 8. And in this case, the Supreme Court was sending back a decision to the state of California to say that it would be legal for same-sex marriages to be acknowledged in that state. And again, another milestone, because here we have, in a different context, the acknowledgement by our federal government that states do have the right to set their marriage laws, and in the case of California, it would be approved for them to acknowledge same-sex marriage. Now, if you think about that moment, again, it was a moment for me of being overwhelmed. Not so much emotionally overwhelmed. I think I was more overwhelmed by the sort of speed and the veracity by which the news came, right? You turned on the TV, there was announcements on June 26, 2013 about this great moment. Twitter feeds, Facebook, conversations with people. Everywhere you turned, you were hearing about this moment. We finally broke through, right? We being the sort of lavender, the pink triangle. We are breaking through. And I was in this moment pondering a few questions myself because I felt a sense of accomplishment in the sense that people were organizing for years around this moment, particularly organizations like the Human Rights Campaign, the National Lesbian and Gay Task Force. And to see their work, if you will, pay off to me was definitely something to hold up. But I was also a bit torn. As I told a friend, the sort of celebration that was happening, I felt like I was on the outside looking in. And what I mean by that is I didn't have any objection to this idea of marriage, if you will, and particularly the ability for people, many of whom were struggling for years to see this happen, to see this moment. But I did have an issue with what I saw as a particular framing of this moment as progress. And I say framing as progress because it was also during that moment, if you think back to that June month, if you will, but a few weeks earlier, that same Supreme Court made a decision that certain protections that were put in place by our Voting Rights Act, protections particularly against racial discrimination in voting, were unnecessary. They were not needed anymore. And I found that a bit ironic, in fact, because the Supreme Court could say this as if we have arrived at some notion of racial equity in voting, when it had just been a few months earlier in the 2012 election cycle that many of you probably remember. Great movement, especially on the conservative right, to keep particularly minorities and undocumented people and immigrants from voting. So I was torn, right? I was torn in this moment about progress in the sense of marriage, but what felt like a setback, especially for people of color and other non-white bodies when it came to their basic fundamental right to vote. So I say that to say that the celebration that was happening, and it was a celebration, as many of you know, the decision was just a few days prior to our Seattle Pride. And what better reason to get in the fountain and celebrate than the fact that we now have a federal recognition of marriage. But for some of us, we went back to thinking about how did it become that same-sex marriage would become the gold standard by which we think of queer liberation? How did it become that same-sex marriage becomes the sort of queer agenda? And for me, that requires some of us to do a little history check-in, right? And actually, the speaker who was before us at lunch, I think, set up some of this when he went back and sort of thought about the 1970s. And when I think about those decades, particularly the 70s and early 80s, I'm reminded that queer liberation and organizing, even before Stonewall in the late 60s, was happening. We had a queer movement. It looked different than what it probably looks like today, and it felt different, but there was a movement. But what I'm reminded of was that movement that really identified as a queer liberation movement, right? It's interesting language. We use LGBT now, and that's okay. But there was something about being queer and queer liberation that was happening during that time that felt very different than the type of politics I see today, especially with our mainstream LGBT movement. I remember a time, as we heard earlier, where people were organizing to create like Pride Week, but they were also looking to create spaces of community, right? Spaces where people can come together, particularly queer-identified people, to come together. And I'm not exactly sure if the movement for same-sex marriage has the same impetus around community building. Because by definition, right, the institution of marriage, particularly how it's practiced in the United States, as a monogamous two-party contract, is all about privatizing space, right? It's all about you and your partner, not you and your community. So when I think back to that moment in the 70s, I remember a discourse that seemed to be much more rooted in liberation that was what we would call intersectional, right? Queer politics in that time, as we heard acknowledged, and I would stress further from the earlier presenter, that Stonewall, much of the early rebellion were the dykes, if you will, as they call themselves, radical lesbians. But I'm also reminded of a very strong trans community of color, right? If we really go back to Stonewall, right? The bodies of Puerto Rican, Dominican, Black, Asian Pacific Islander, trans women who were actually in the Stonewall Inn standing up to the police. And I remember that moment as being a different type of queer liberation. It was a liberation that was in many ways being not led by, but informed by some of the most vulnerable populations in our community, right? Those bodies that today seem to now be pushed to the margins. And what has now been centered, to me, seems like a much more middle class, corporate, cisgendered, male, white male body, right? The HRC, the National Human Rights Campaign. And when I think about those bodies and what their agenda has been for us in the last 20 years, I'm not too surprised that it is a bit different than what was being asked for back in the 70s and the 80s. Because this particular moment for these bodies, marriage would be the last burden for many of us to cross. Many of us who come with a certain racial privilege, gender privilege, and class privilege. But for the many other bodies where marriage may or may not get us closer to those 1,134 benefits, some of us still have to deal with profiling by police because our bodies are non-white. Some of us have to deal with the realities that because we are gender non-conforming, right, that there is no protection, no place for us to hide. And as much as you want to say it, orange is not the new black. So what is marriage doing? Well, I think for some of us, we have to think first and foremost that part of the reason why those early movements around queer liberation did not center this notion of same-sex marriage as a sort of goal was because much of that movement had a critique of the institution of marriage. And I want to be very clear because we have a lot of married people in the room. Marriage, if it is looked at as nuptials and the ceremony for love, I'm all for it, right? In many ways, I was really for it not too long ago because I had a dear friend who was in a committed relationship with a guy for about a year and started to use the marriage word. And this was important, right? Because in this case, he was thinking more and more about marriage as a Washington state citizen post February 13th, 2012, which in our case, we signed into law the right to same-sex marriage in our state. So it looked for him quite promising that his love could now be, if you will, solidified through marriage. And it's me, always looking to plan somebody's party. I was ready to do the wedding coordination and signed up for the bandwagon. So I'm not against that marriage because I felt love and something very special that he and his partner were forming. Now, a few days after we were talking about the wedding, he did tell me that his partner was cheating on him and he had some issues with being manipulated, but so is life, right? We can never plan the perfect wedding. But I use that example because I think it also talks about the fragility of how we think about even our relationships and marriage as part of that, right? And more so, I think when I think about marriage as a sense of nuptials, I'm reminded that the dominant movement, the LGBT movement, that's not how they've been framing marriage, right? Marriage has been rooted in what it has always been, a legal contractual arrangement. And when you read what the mainstream movement today has been using to push for marriage, they go quickly to laws to suggest that as lesbian and gay, and I'm going to start with the LG, because bisexual and transgender people are not part of this conversation around marriage, that we should have equal protection, right? Equal protection under the law. Or we refer to this idea that our need to be married as LG people is similar to the anti-miscegenation movements that happened up until 1969 that prevented interracial marriage, that there's something unconstitutional. But if you also look at the dominant narrative around why we should have LG marriage or same-sex marriage, it also goes at what marriage has always done, to regulate wealth. And what I mean by wealth is much of what we get through the institution of marriage is not so much a solidifying of our love for our partner, but if you will, a crystallizing of how we're going to deal with those 1,134 benefits that we want from the state. Or how we're going to make sure that whatever I earned, if you're lucky enough to have a job where you earn something, can be inherited by my partner. Or maybe my marriage is going to allow me then to have access to adoption agencies because now I can adopt children. So there's a sense that through this institution of marriage, the mainstream is telling us we need marriage because we're trying to acquire something, not because we're recognizing community and love that we have. And so for me, that institution of marriage has to be called into question, and this is what I'm intended to do with you today, right? I want to be very clear. I don't question the right for anyone to pronounce their love, their nuptials. I want us to maybe question what exactly are we assimilating into when we talk as a movement about the right to same-sex marriage. Because again, the institution of marriage, particularly in the United States, has always been an institution of exclusion, regulation, and oppression. So then I think about, since we are at this moment of progress, how is it that the Supreme Court, for some people, was making a big leap forward in the movement for civil rights with the decision around DOMA and Prop 8. But yet we have a same Supreme Court, as I said earlier, that was engaging in some other less progressive moments, such as the voting rights issue. But let's not stop there. This is the same Supreme Court that just last week engaged in a ban on affirmative action. This is the same Supreme Court that not too long ago was also making it harder and harder for individuals, particularly Native individuals, to find protection. I think this is also the same Supreme Court that said that corporations are people, and therefore the use of money in campaigns, which we know the result of that, is okay as free speech. The same Supreme Court, I think, that also is engaged in making it harder and harder for people to immigrate into the US. So I want to think about this moment that we're in with this institution of marriage is not really being that different than these other decisions. And you may be asking, how is that? There's definitely nothing similar to the fact that now same-sex individuals can get married to what happened with the decision around the Voting Rights Act. And I think for me, what it comes back to is the fact that as a Supreme Court and as a nation, where we're moving more and more is to a politics of privatization, right? And what do I mean by that is more and more we're looking at ways to move people off, if you will, the state roles. We can see this with regards to how welfare has been treated, food stamps. We see this more and more with the ways in which public spaces are becoming privatized. Corporations are beginning to merge. Look at your cable, Comcast. It's becoming harder and harder for us to have public spaces. And again, by definition, the institution of marriage is a privatizing space. It's intended to privatize, but it's also an institution when we look at the way it relates to the federal government that often puts distance between the responsibility of the state back on you as a married couple. So for example, when we think about the growing number of people who will be single and may be single for life, we have to ask ourselves, where do we go to find health care? Must I enter into the institution of marriage to be able to have health care? Where do I turn to make sure that I have access to my partner or partners who may be in the hospital? Must I be married to get recognition? Where do I turn if I want to be able to have other types of what I think are human rights? And as one noted feminist says, the movement has lost its track because we assume that by assimilating into the institution of marriage, we're gaining these rights, when we should be trying to divorce marriage from these rights to begin with. Right? Why is it that the only way some of us can access and ascertain certain types of benefits is through needing to enter into an institution that, as I said earlier, many of us, regardless of how much you try, will not be able to just demographically, right? And there's a privatization there. Because what the state is doing to us is it's saying that certain benefits you can acquire either through entering into this institution of marriage or by having a job. And by having a job, for many of us, we know, particularly in this economy, is becoming more and more difficult. So again, the idea of the state as a welfare state, caring for all of its people, is able to be pushed to you as the individual to say, well, if you want these benefits, find someone to marry. Well, maybe I'll just activate my Scruff account one more time. But I've been trying. Sometimes it's a little difficult because I don't fit the profile of what people are looking for, and I'm okay with that. But the point is, the state has found a way through the institution of marriage to say that if you want certain benefits, find someone to marry or find a job. So now I want to shift to where I think, on a more positive note for me, is why I talk about beyond marriage. And it's not just me, it's a body, maybe small, of queer-identified people, many of us influenced by some of the activism of the early queer liberation movement, but more so influenced by something known as the Black feminist movement. Women like Audre Lorde. Women who, through their everyday struggles, their everyday realities of being Black women, Black queer women, they have an insight on oppression that sometimes even I, as a queer Black man, can't always have. Right? I heard it said earlier, right, that sexism that sometimes blinds us as queer men, we need to have that called into accountability. And therefore, having spaces, particularly where some of the most vulnerable are part of that, we begin to realize the failings of our politics, the failings of same-sex marriage as an agenda, not as a right, but as an agenda. And when I think about the Beyond Marriage, Beyond Equality movement, and I'm thinking of people like Dean Spade, one of our local trans heroes. He does work at Seattle University. I'm thinking about people like Kenyon Farrow, a friend of mine in New Orleans who's been an organizer and activist for years. I'm thinking about these people because what they remind us is something that actually happened that took the movement we were on in the early 70s, which was never perfect. I think the presenter earlier made it clear. These were not unified movements even around Pride Week. People had different politics. But there was a certain type of agenda that was larger than just marriage. And what these speakers remind us is that the movement away from what may have been a more collective notion of justice to this much more individualistic and, dare I say, commercial, especially when we look at how our prides have become less about a Pride Week to a whole spectacle where major corporations, some of which should never be supporting us because of the things they do to our community, but nonetheless, right? That there was a shift even to that kind of mainstreaming, that these scholars and these activists remind me that part of what was happening is that there were bodies entering in the late 80s into the queer movements that were not really part of a lot of those early movements in the early 70s. And what was bringing those bodies into the movement, unfortunately, happened to be the AIDS epidemic in our community. So organizations like ACT UP, which were very needed, right, were beginning to create spaces around organizing, particularly organizing against a former president who couldn't even utter the words AIDS, let alone have any care for our community, to start mobilizing people to have a much stronger push, particularly around queer health. And what some organizers remind us is that some of those bodies, as a result of the AIDS epidemic, were bodies that otherwise were not really radicalized, meaning, they were probably aware of some of the things happening at the queer centers and all of that, but these were bodies that maybe because of their class, race, or sex privilege could care less. But the crippling effect of HIV/AIDS on our community caused people to have to start to organize. So they were entering into movements. Many of these movements were led by people of color, non-gender conforming bodies. And what particularly Matilda, a San Francisco activist, reminds us is that many of those, as they came into the community and the movements that were already moving for a larger idea of justice, they became very much intimidated by all of these people of color, radical, queer, feminists, socialists acting up, right? Many of them were uncomfortable, according to these scholars, because they were calling many of these folks into conversation about their own privilege. So our mainstream movements actually start, when we think about the HRC, the Human Rights Campaign, these organizations actually start as a sort of, if you will, alternative to the more radical politics that were happening with queer liberation in the early 70s and 80s. These movements, which were by definition much more conservative, thought that what we need to do is shift away from all of this radical conversation and start talking about a politics of respectability, right? How do we start to make queer people more respectable in the eyes of straight folks? And this is also being played off of the whole AIDS epidemic. So the need to change the look of our community from mainly men who are dying and looking frail to hard, beefy bodies. To move away from us looking vulnerable to us looking glamorous. This was part of the respectability, but it's also about making us look the same. And this is part of the movement, particularly the more conservative elements of the movement, where the marriage movement picks up, right? We want you to know, straight America, you don't have to fear us. We're just like you. We have our committed relationships. We want to have our suburban house. We want to adopt our children. And this notion of respectability begins to form what we now know as the marriage movement, which at its heart is about a certain element of our larger queer community wanting to take ownership of what they think the agenda should be. And for them, that agenda becomes about marriage. It becomes also about gays in the military, which that becomes another Jake talk, because I think there's something interesting to me about the idea that there's progress in us getting rid of don't ask, don't tell, especially when we think about US militarism around the world. The idea of respectability becomes important because what it then says is that for some of us gay bodies and queer bodies, if you're not conforming to this very heteronormative idea of coupling, we don't want to have you too much in the forefront. And that means also for some of these bodies, you have to look a certain way racially. You have to also look a certain way aesthetically, right? It's very interesting when you track the cases that have been pushed forward for the same-sex marriage. You're not finding many people, in respect to some of our guests here, who are in the leather community. You're not going to find too many trans people being put forward, right? Because again, it's a politics of respectability, and the marriage movement is all about how do we make ourselves look appealing to a sort of mainstream culture that sees us as being perverted. So to get beyond marriage means getting beyond that as our politics, as a queer community, right? That's where I'm at. That we have to get to a place where there's no litmus test for what is the respectable queer, but that we start to think about a politics that is going to be much more collective, inclusive, and hopefully much more transformative of the larger society. Not just transformative about who you can walk down the aisle with, but to make sure that for some of us who don't walk down the aisle, that we can still have access to things that we need so we can walk in the first place. For me, getting beyond marriage, getting beyond, if you will, the equality movement is not about people saying, I should not get married. That's not the point. It's about, again, us being reflexive and critical enough that entering into this institution should not be your path to turn your back on the other community that cannot, which means we need to talk about how do we build queer community. And for that, I'm reminded again of some examples of that, right? We have examples around. Sometimes I think our sense of not knowing what to do is because we're not looking always in the right places. So we think about, for example, community as it looked in the late 60s, early 70s in New York as the ball community, right? The ball. And the early ball community, which was captured in some ways by the very famous documentary Paris is Burning, I think is one example of what not only community looks like, but communities of queer people of color, working people, people who are really on the fringes, how they forged community, even when in our queer community they were not accepted, right? When they didn't fit the look of Chelsea or the Village. They had to find their own spaces. And they did, and the ball scene is one example of that. The idea that we will be families of choice, we don't need the state to recognize our families, and that we will, at the heart of it, care for each other, right? We will care for each other. Not just my partner who I've shared nuptials with, but everyone who comes into this, all my children, right? I'm going to care for you. So the ball scene, I think, is a good example of what a sort of larger idea of family and community could look like. That doesn't just require us to think about this idea of a very heteronormative notion of marriage. If I can say one more thing about community too, and I think it also requires us, particularly those of us who are in positions of power and privilege, to ask who's not part of our communities. You know, I really am grateful again for Victor because I notice an intentionality in him wanting to have diversity in his speakers, racially, ethnically, how we show up in our bodies. And that's a sense of thinking that sometimes we don't see happening in some of our large mainstream, even queer movements. Right? Our inattention to some of the racism, sexism, femophobia, transphobia in our communities is an imperative or a barrier, I should say, to us having true community. So when we think about building community, I want us to also ask not who's here, but also who isn't. And why is that the case? I'm aware that during this same time, there's a documentary that's being screened as part of the Langston Hughes African American Film Festival called The New Black. And some of you may or may not have heard of it or seen it. I'm aware of the film and its portrayal or its documentary, if you will, of a particular gay marriage ban in North Carolina and some of the issues around that, or Maryland. But one of the things I'm also reminded of is that we've had people even here locally who've written about this idea of black homophobia that I think also is something as a community gets in the way from us having true community. This idea that when Prop 8 happened in California, it was because of black people and their homophobia. And for me, I take issue with that because when I think about building community, a queer community, I'm reminded that a queer community is not a community that is only queer people, but we must bridge because all of our issues are interrelated. And therefore, the inability for some of us to see the lack of people of color, even in this space, is a problem. And that for some of us, as one of our noted scholars, authors, Dan Savage, wrote when he wrote the piece, Black Homophobia, that to assume that Prop 8 was the result of black people's conservatism, I think is very, very foolish. In part because blacks make less than 7% of California's population, and of that percentage, very few of them even have access to the vote because of something called disenfranchisement, because of the prison system. But yet, we are creating in our queer community this way of sort of saying, some people just can't be part of our community because for some reason they just don't care for our issues. When I want to turn it back on us to ask, what are we doing to forge community across those bridges, across those divides? Because I'm reminded that much of the early queer liberation movement had to root itself with people of color, with feminists of color, in part because many of these movements, people were settling in those spaces. I'm not exactly sure of all the politics around early Seattle on Capitol Hill, but when I heard the speaker speak about where people were setting up community, I'm reminded of the Castro and the fact that for many queer bodies, particularly queer white male bodies, we did find refuge in people of color spaces, in immigrant spaces, like the Mission District. So this idea of bridging is something I think we've lost sight of when we think about our sort of internal identity politics, when we think queer community is only queer people, when a sort of notion of queer justice has to be my progress is dependent on what's happening to many undocumented immigrant workers who are being deported by the thousands out of Tacoma. My queer justice comes when I know that young people, particularly young homeless queer people, are not going to be put into cages at our juvenile justice center, or what I call the juvenile jail. My queer justice in my queer community cannot be a true community if I'm missing the voices, particularly of women. So for me, and I'll say this as my closing, I am very much grateful for this community. It's not a complete community, but what community is. But what is important to a queer community for me is the intentionality that we bring to it. And if our intention as a community is just to have a wedding that we can go to on a Saturday, or to say that somebody was able to put their nuptials in the lifestyle section of the Seattle Times paper, I think that community is limiting. I would like for us to think of a community where if you can't love the one you want, we all love the ones we're with. Thank you.